Laughter tore through the living room like shattered glass. Audrey Bennett stood rooted by the doorway, both hands clenched so hard her knuckles went white, while relatives showed off New Year's Eve gifts that cost more than a full year of her salary. A 5-carat diamond ring, a trip to Europe, a brand new Rolex. And she stood there in an old dress she'd worn through 3 holiday seasons, trying not to tremble. Someone asked loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "Audrey still doesn't have anyone? Poor Ruth. She'll probably pass away without ever seeing her granddaughter loved by somebody." The laughter swelled. No one bothered to look at her. No one needed to. That was when Audrey slipped outside, stepping into the freezing Long Island night. She saw a man standing by the gate, tall, in a dark coat, as if he were waiting for something in the shadows. She didn't think. She pulled out a crumpled $100 bill, a month's worth of tips, pressed it into his hand, and whispered with a shaking voice, "I know this is crazy, but please, pretend to be my boyfriend tonight, just for a few hours. I don't need you to talk much, just stand beside me." The man looked at her. He didn't laugh. He didn't pity her. Just a gaze that saw straight through, as if weighing something far larger than she imagined. Then he nodded. "Maxim," he said. Just one word. They walked into the house together, him in shoes that weren't designer, a simple coat, eyes strangely calm. The relatives turned, whispering. Aunt Patricia arched a brow. Cousin Brittany covered her mouth with a sneer of a laugh. Then the entire room went dead silent. A security guard froze in place, his hand rising to his chest, as if by reflex. Gerald, the 80-year-old butler, dropped the drink tray. Glass exploded across the marble floor. His face blanched like a man who'd just seen a ghost. And Maxim, the man she'd just hired for $100, faltered mid-step. His eyes locked onto the black and white photograph on the wall. A photo from the 1990s, capturing the most powerful businessmen in New York. And standing among them, a Russian man with ice-sharp eyes, Dmitry Volkov, the most infamous underground empire boss on the east coast of America. That face, it was Maxim's, as if they were 2 drops of water. Gerald stumbled back a step, his voice breaking into a hoarse whisper. "It can't be." Maxim didn't look at anyone. He only stood there, jaw clenched tight, eyes refusing to leave the photograph. He shouldn't have shown up here. And Audrey Bennett, the girl who desperately hired a stranger just to survive one night, had no idea who she'd just brought into the house. The man whose hand she was holding wasn't some drifter off the street. He was the 3rd-generation head of the Volkov Empire, a man being hunted, a man hiding under a false name while searching for the traitor. And that traitor is someone right here in this room. Before we continue, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you live right now? If you love stories about unexpected love, about strong women who push through hardship, and about dark secrets waiting to be exposed, please hit like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. The story has only just begun, but to understand why Audrey Bennett was standing there, trembling in that old dress, ready to press $100 into a stranger's hand just so someone would stand beside her, we need to turn back the clock 19 years. Audrey was 8 when the accident happened. On a night of relentless rain on the highway, her parents' car was hit head-on by an out-of-control truck. Her father died on the spot. Her mother held on for 2 days in the emergency room before her heart finally stopped. Audrey wasn't in the car that day because she was at her grandmother's house, waiting for her parents to pick her up after a short business trip. She remembers sitting by the window all night, watching the rain come down, wondering why they still hadn't come home. The next morning, when Ruth wrapped her in her arms and cried, Audrey still didn't understand what was happening. It took a long time after that for her to truly grasp that the door would never open again to welcome her parents back. Ruth took Audrey in right after the funeral. She was the only one in the Bennett family willing to do it. Uncle Howard, Audrey's mother's younger brother, was already married to Patricia and had a daughter of his own, Brittany. They managed the Bennett family assets, a clan that had once been wealthy through real estate. And they weren't happy when Ruth used her own money to raise an orphaned granddaughter. Patricia had said it outright at a family dinner, thinking Audrey couldn't hear. She's wasting money on a child who isn't even blood. Audrey stood behind the kitchen door, her hand clenched around the teddy bear her mother had given her, and for the first time in her life, she understood what it felt like to be seen as a burden. In the years that followed, Audrey grew up wrapped in Ruth's love, yet also under the shadow of contempt from the rest of the family. Every holiday, she was measured against Brittany, the cousin who always had everything Audrey didn't: expensive clothes, an elite private school, lavish trips, and most of all, the family's approval. Audrey learned to lower her head. She learned to be quiet. She learned to make herself smaller so no one would notice. She never asked for anything, because she knew that every time she needed something, Patricia would remind everyone of the burden Ruth had taken on. When Audrey was 20, Ruth was diagnosed with lung cancer. After that, everything changed. Audrey left college to care for her. She worked 2 jobs at once, waiting tables on the night shift at an Italian restaurant in Manhattan and cleaning offices from 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock every morning. The money she earned was split in 2. Half went to Ruth's medical bills, half went to rent for a miserable studio apartment in Queens, where the walls were damp with mold and the heater was broken all winter. She had no time left for herself, no strength left to dream, and no tears left to cry for her own life. But what exhausted Audrey most wasn't the work or the money. What exhausted her was Ruth's eyes every time she looked at her. Ruth was worried. Ruth was afraid. Not afraid of the death drawing near, but afraid that when she was gone, Audrey would be completely alone in this world. Every time Audrey came to visit, Ruth asked the same question. "Do you have someone? Does someone love you?" And every time, Audrey lied. "I'm fine, Grandma. I'm not alone." She lied because she didn't want Ruth to hurt. She lied because it was the only thing she could give her to keep her calm. But every night, returning to that empty apartment, Audrey asked herself the same question in the dark. Was she living, or was she only existing? And then, New Year's Eve arrived. Ruth was too weak to leave the hospital, but she begged Audrey to go to the family party, to try to fit in, to show them she was all right. Audrey couldn't refuse her. She put on the faded fabric that had witnessed too many winters, stepped into the brightly lit mansion on Long Island, and once again faced those familiar looks of contempt. She never imagined that night, one reckless decision with her last $100 would completely change her life. And the man she had just led into that house, the man who made an entire room fall silent, would be the first person to truly see who she was. But Audrey wasn't the only one carrying a painful past into the Bennett mansion that night. The man she hired for $100, the man who made the elderly butler drop the drink tray, had scars no one could see. Maxim Volkov was born into an empire. Not an empire of light and glory, but an empire of shadow, of underground power, of deals made in silence and debts paid in blood. His father, Dmitry Volkov, was the second-generation boss, the man who turned a small crew of Russian immigrants into an empire that controlled maritime freight, container ports, and protection rackets up and down the east coast of the United States. On paper, they were Volkov Shipping International, a legitimate logistics company. In the dark, they were the people no one dared to refuse. Maxim had been trained to inherit that throne since he was a child. He learned to read people before he learned to read books, learned to hold a gun before he learned to hold a pen. But he wasn't alone. He had Irina, a sister 5 years younger, the only person in the world who could make Maxim smile without calculation. And he had Konstantin Petrov, an orphan his father brought home from a children's shelter outside Moscow when the boy was 10. Konstantin grew up beside Maxim like a brother, trained the same way, trusted the same way. But there was one thing Konstantin could never have: the heir's place. No matter how hard he tried, in Dmitry Volkov's eyes, Konstantin would always be second. 5 years ago, everything collapsed. Irina was 22, full of life and stubborn the way young women often are. She loved Konstantin, and Konstantin loved her. But Maxim objected. He didn't trust Konstantin, not because Konstantin had done anything wrong, but because Maxim's instincts kept whispering that something in his adopted brother's eyes wasn't right whenever he looked at Maxim. Maxim forbade Irina from seeing Konstantin. She begged, she cried, she raged, but Maxim didn't budge. He thought he was protecting his sister. He thought he was doing the right thing. On the night that changed everything, Maxim received intelligence about an attack being planned. He ordered Irina to stay inside, not to go out for any reason. But Irina didn't listen. She slipped out to meet Konstantin, who had asked her to see him at a small cafe on the other side of the city. She thought her brother was too old-fashioned, too controlling, too tyrannical. She thought she had the right to love whoever she wanted. She didn't know it would be the last decision of her life. Irina's car was ambushed on the road. 3 shots tore through the windshield. She died on the spot, her eyes still open, her phone still lit with the last message she had sent Constantine. "I'm coming." Maxim found his sister's body in the driving rain. He held her all night, her blood soaking through his clothes, and for the first time in his life, Maxim Volkov cried. After Irina's death, Maxim threw himself into the investigation. He needed to know who had given the order, who had leaked his sister's schedule to the killers. The answer he uncovered left him frozen. Constantine, the adopted brother he had once loved as blood. Constantine hadn't pulled the trigger himself, but it was he who told the Volkov's enemies where she would be that night. Maybe he hadn't expected them to kill her. Maybe he only wanted chaos so he could seize power. But whatever the reason, Irina was dead, and Constantine was guilty. But when Maxim was ready to move, Constantine had vanished. He took money with him, he took secrets, and he took his hatred. For 5 years, he quietly built a faction, laundered money through shell companies, and waited for the day he could overthrow Maxim. And Maxim, instead of chasing him in the open, chose another path. He stepped into the shadows, disappeared behind a false name, lived like an ordinary man while he followed each thread. He wanted to find every ally Constantine had before he struck, so no one would escape. The latest lead brought him to Long Island. An investment firm called Whitmore Capital was laundering money for Constantine, and the man running it, Preston Whitmore III, was about to marry a Bennett daughter. On New Year's Eve, Maxim came to the Bennett estate to watch, to gather information. He stood outside the gate, waiting for Yuri to confirm the data, with no intention of stepping inside. Then a girl appeared, shaking in attire far too thin for the freezing night, her eyes red as if she'd been crying, one crumpled $100 bill in her hand. She pressed the money into his palm and asked him to pretend to be her boyfriend. Maxim meant to refuse. He had more important work, but then he looked into her eyes, and his heart felt like someone had closed a fist around it. Those eyes looked like Irina's on her last night, exhausted, alone, desperate, yet still upright, still not begging. He couldn't walk away. He nodded, said only one word, Maxim, and followed her into the house, not knowing that fate had already begun. Disiak began at 9 o'clock, and from the very first minute, Audrey knew she'd stepped into a battle. The whole family sat around a long table draped in white linen, candles flickering, extravagant dishes spread everywhere, yet the air itself was cold as ice. Patricia sat at the head like a queen, her sharp gaze sliding over Maxim from head to toe, weighing every detail he wore. Brittany sat beside Preston, her 5-carat engagement ring throwing off flashes of light every time she lifted her hand, as if she were deliberately reminding everyone of her rank. And Howard sat in silence, eyes lowered to his wineglass, avoiding confrontation the way he'd avoided it his entire life. Patricia was the first to fire. She set her knife and fork down slowly, then smiled at Maxim with a smile that never reached her eyes. "So, Maxim, what do you do for a living? We're very curious to know who Audrey has managed to find." The question sounded polite, but her voice was heavy with implication, as if she already knew the answer would humiliate Audrey. Audrey felt her chest tighten, her fingers twisting the napkin beneath the table until it creased. She glanced at Maxim, afraid he'd fumble, afraid he'd say something that would make her look even smaller in their eyes. But Maxim didn't fumble at all. He set his water glass down, met Patricia's stare with a calm that felt almost unnerving, and said, "I work in shipping." Preston, who'd been watching in silence, let out a short, scornful laugh. "Shipping? Like driving a truck? Or delivering for Amazon?" Brittany covered her mouth and snickered along, her eyes dripping contempt. But Maxim didn't so much as blink. He turned his head toward Preston, eyes sharpened to something like steel, as if he were reading lines of text written across the other man's face. "No," he said evenly, like owning a fleet. The table went silent. Preston stiffened, the grin dying on his mouth. Patricia's brows lifted, and for the first time she looked genuinely surprised. Brittany stared at Maxim, as if she'd just discovered something she didn't have a name for. Only Audrey didn't fully understand what had just happened, yet she could feel the room shift, as if something heavy had moved beneath the floorboards. Brittany was the first to recover. She gave a thin laugh, scrambling to reclaim the high ground. "Owning a fleet and dressing like that? I thought wealthy men paid more attention to appearances." Maxim answered without hesitation, "I don't see the need to wear money on my body to prove I have money. That's only necessary for people who aren't confident in their real worth. Brittany choked on her words, her face flushing red with anger. Patricia shot her daughter a warning look, then redirected her attack toward an easier target. Audrey, Patricia said in that syrupy false sweetness. You're still waiting tables at that Italian restaurant, aren't you? How pitiful. I'm sure Maxim here doesn't mind his girlfriend serving other people, does he? Audrey lowered her head, that familiar sensation of humiliation sliding down her spine like a cold hand. She wanted to vanish, to crawl under the table, to be anywhere but here. But before she could open her mouth, Maxim spoke. He set his knife and fork down slowly, deliberately, then looked straight at Patricia. Do you think honest work is something to be ashamed of? Patricia blinked. I'm just being realistic. Maxim cut her off. The reality is Audrey works to take care of her grandmother. She holds 2 jobs, asks no one in this room for a single dollar, while some people here live on other people's money and still think they have the right to judge. That's the reality. The room went deathly still for the second time that night. Howard cleared his throat, trying to ease the tension, and failing miserably. Brittany opened her mouth as if to protest, but Preston put a hand on her arm, signaling her to be quiet. There was something in Preston's eyes that caught Audrey's attention. He wasn't looking at Maxim with contempt anymore. He was looking at him with caution, as if he were trying to identify a threat he couldn't yet measure. Then Maxim did something that made the entire table freeze. He turned toward Preston, his voice as casual as if he were commenting on the weather. Whitmore Capital, right? I've heard of your firm. Your recent transactions are interesting. Preston went pale. Not pale with anger or embarrassment, but pale with fear. Audrey saw it as clearly as daylight. Preston's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his wineglass, and his eyes flicked toward the door as if he were searching for an exit. You know about my company? Preston asked, forcing calm into his voice, though it came out a shade too high. Maxim smiled, but there was no warmth in it at all. I know a lot of things. Audrey looked from Maxim to Preston, then from Preston back to Maxim. She didn't understand what they were really talking about, but she knew something was happening beneath the surface of this conversation. The man she'd hired for $100 wasn't just a stranger standing outside the gate. He knew something. He was dangerous, and for some reason, he was here, in this house, sitting beside her. The question was, why? Audrey swallowed hard, her heart tripping over itself. Who had she pulled into her life tonight? After that tense dinner, when everyone drifted into the living room to get ready for the countdown to the new year, something unexpected happened. Ruth, the woman Audrey had believed was far too weak to leave the hospital, appeared in the mansion. It turned out she'd asked a nurse to bring her, just so she could see her granddaughter on New Year's Eve, even though the doctors had advised her to rest. She sat in a wheelchair in the corner of the room, thin and pale, yet her eyes were still bright, still sharp, as if illness had never managed to defeat her. When Audrey rushed over to hold her, eyes burning red with emotion, Ruth only smiled and smoothed her granddaughter's hair. I wanted to meet the special person in your life. Then she looked toward Maxim, who stood a few steps away, and her gaze settled on his face, the way one reads an open book. Ruth motioned for Maxim to come closer, then spoke to Audrey in a gentle voice that carried quiet authority. Go get me a glass of water. I want to speak with him alone for a moment. Audrey hesitated, worried as she glanced at Maxim, but he gave her a reassuring nod. Reluctantly, she stepped away, still looking back over her shoulder. When only the two of them remained, Ruth pointed to the chair beside her wheelchair. Sit down, my boy. Maxim sat, and for the first time that night, he felt he no longer had control of the situation. There was something in the old woman's eyes that unsettled him, as if she could see through every layer he'd spent years building around himself. Ruth didn't waste time. She met Maxim's gaze and asked, You're not an ordinary man, are you? Maxim held silence for a beat, then said, I have a complicated past. Ruth nodded slowly, as if the answer confirmed what she'd already suspected. I've lived long enough to recognize a dangerous man when I meet one, but I'm also old enough to know dangerous doesn't always mean evil. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. I only want to know one thing. Will you hurt Audrey? The question was simple, but it landed like a stone. Maxim looked into her eyes that had witnessed an entire lifetime of joy and grief, and he realized he couldn't lie, not because she would catch him, but because he didn't want to. This was the first time in 5 years someone had looked at him and not seen power, Not money, not fear. Ruth saw him, the real man beneath the name, and it left Maxim feeling exposed in a way he'd never known. "I'd rather hurt myself than let her suffer anything more," Maxim answered, his voice lower than usual. Ruth studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Audrey is stronger than she thinks. But she's forgotten that. Maybe you'll help her remember." Maxim left that corner with his heart heavy, not understanding how a frail old woman could make him feel so stripped bare. Meanwhile, in another corner of the mansion, a plot was being set in motion. Brittany pulled Preston into an empty hallway, her face flushed with rage. "That man humiliated me in front of the whole family. I can't let it go." Preston no longer had the arrogance he'd worn at the start of the evening. After Maxim's remark about Whitmore Capital, he'd grown restless, his eyes constantly flicking around as if he feared someone was watching. "That guy knows something. What he said about my firm wasn't random." Brittany frowned. "Who do you think he is?" Preston shook his head. "I don't know, but it's all the more reason to get rid of Audrey. If she brought him here, she's a problem." Brittany thought for a moment, and then her eyes lit with a cruel idea. "I have the diamond bracelet Mom gave me. If it disappears, and someone finds it in somebody's coat pocket?" Preston smiled for the first time since dinner. "You're smart." Brittany slipped into the coat room, where Audrey's old coat hung limp beside expensive fur coats. She looked around to make sure no one was watching, then quickly unclasped the diamond bracelet from her wrist and shoved it deep into Audrey's pocket. Her heart beat fast with excitement. Tonight, that orphan girl would be exposed as a thief in front of the entire family. Tonight, she would vanish from their lives for good. Brittany returned to the living room with a satisfied smile on her lips, not knowing that in the shadowed corner of the hallway, Gerald had seen everything. The elderly butler stood in the darkness, sorrow in his eyes, his hand gripping the doorframe. He had served the Bennett family for 40 years, and he knew exactly how much cruelty could hide beneath expensive clothes. Audrey found Maxim standing alone on the back balcony of the mansion. He was looking out over the garden buried under white snow, his breath turning into thin streams of smoke in the bitter air. She walked over to stand beside him, arms folded tight across her chest to keep warm, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Music and laughter drifted out from inside, but out here on this balcony, everything felt as if it belonged to a different world. At last, Audrey broke the silence. "Thank you for what you said at dinner." Maxim turned to look at her. "I only said the truth." Audrey gave a sad little smile. "The truth isn't always welcome in this house." She leaned against the railing, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the yard. "You know, every year I ask myself why I come here, why I keep letting them treat me like this." Maxim stayed quiet, waiting. Audrey drew in a deep breath, the cold cutting into her lungs, and she didn't care. "The answer is Ruth. She's the only person in this world who's ever truly seen me. Not as a burden, not as someone living off charity, but as me, and she wants the family together. She believes blood can change, that people can learn to love each other. I don't have the courage to tell her she's wrong." Her voice trembled slightly as she went on. "She's dying, you know. Terminal cancer. The doctors say a few months, maybe less. And the only thing she worries about isn't herself, it's me. She's afraid that when she's gone, I'll be completely alone. She asks me every day, 'Do you have someone? Does someone love you?' And I keep lying. I lie because I don't want her to be sad. But every night I go back to my empty apartment, and I ask myself what I'm doing with my life." Maxim watched her, and for a moment he saw himself in it. The loneliness, the fear of failure, the weight of lies wrapped in love. He asked softly, "What are you most afraid of?" Audrey didn't need to think. "I'm afraid she'll die believing I failed, that I'm not good enough, not pretty enough, not worthy enough for anyone to love me. I'm afraid she'll carry that worry with her into the next world." She let out a bitter laugh. "It's ridiculous. I work 2 jobs. I take care of her. I've never asked anyone for $1, but in this family's eyes, I'm still the failure." Maxim turned fully to face her, his voice low and slow. "You're not a failure. You're surviving." Audrey looked up and met his eyes. "Is there a difference?" Maxim nodded. "Surviving is trying not to sink. Living is choosing where you swim. You've survived for 27 years. But have you ever asked yourself how you want to live?" The question struck something deep inside Audrey, a place she'd tried to abandon a long time ago. She couldn't answer because she didn't have an answer. The wind swept across the balcony and made her shiver. Without a word, Maxim took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. Audrey started to refuse, but he'd already turned away to look back at the garden, as if it meant nothing at all. Warmth spread across her shoulders, and Audrey realized this was the first time in so long that someone had cared about her without demanding anything in return. She studied Maxim from the side, the light from inside catching his face, and she wondered who he really was. He spoke of owning a fleet, as if it were ordinary. He mentioned Preston's company, as if he knew something. And he stood here in the cold night, sharing silence with a girl he'd met only hours ago. "Are you surviving too?" Audrey asked quietly. Maxim didn't turn back, but she saw his shoulders tighten slightly. He didn't answer, and that silence said more than any words could. They stood there a while longer, two strangers sharing a moment neither of them fully understood. Then a shriek from inside shattered everything. Brittany burst into the living room, her voice high and piercing. "My bracelet, the diamond bracelet Mom gave me. It's gone." Audrey and Maxim hurried back in. Chaos hit them at once. Patricia stood in the center of the room, her face hard as ice. "No one leaves until we find it." Eyes began to sweep the room, and little by little, gaze after gaze landed on Audrey. Brittany stepped toward her, her tone dripping with meaning. "Audrey, were you alone in the coat room? I saw you coming out of there earlier." Audrey stammered. "I only got my coat so I could go out to the balcony." Patricia cut her off. "Check her pockets." A security guard stepped forward and searched the pockets of Audrey's coat. Seconds later, he pulled out the diamond bracelet, sparkling under the lights. The entire room stopped breathing. Audrey stared at it, eyes wide with horror. "No, I didn't take it. I swear I don't know when it got in there." But no one listened. Brittany clutched her chest in a dramatic gesture. "I can't believe it. I gave you a chance and you repay me by stealing?" Patricia shook her head in a performance of disappointment. "I always knew this day would come. Like mother, like daughter. Your mother would be ashamed." Howard sat still, staring down at the floor, not saying a single word. Audrey felt the ground collapse beneath her. She looked around for help and found only eyes full of contempt, and a satisfaction that made her stomach turn. Tears surged up, but she forced them back. She wouldn't cry in front of them. She wouldn't give them that pleasure. In the moment, Audrey stood there like a defendant in court. Maxim stepped forward. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply stood there with a calm that was more frightening than any burst of fury could have been. His voice cut through the noise like a sharp blade. "Stop!" The whole room turned to him. Patricia frowned. "You don't have the right to speak here. This is family business." Maxim didn't so much as flinch, his gaze sweeping over each of them as if he were taking their measure. "You're condemning someone without real proof." Brittany let out a scornful laugh. "The proof is sitting in her pocket. What more do you need?" Maxim looked Brittany straight in the eye, and she took an unconscious step back under that stare. "I need the truth. This mansion has a security camera system, doesn't it? Check the coat room footage." A strange silence dropped over the room. Patricia shot a quick look toward Brittany, and Audrey caught something off in that glance. Preston, standing beside Brittany, went a shade paler. Only Howard nodded. "That's a good idea. Gerald, pull up the cameras." The old butler nodded and moved quickly, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Minutes later, the family gathered around a computer screen in Howard's office. The security footage played, and everything appeared as clear as daylight. On the video, Brittany slipped into the coat room, looked around to make sure no one could see, then unclasped the diamond bracelet from her own wrist and shoved it deep into Audrey's coat pocket. Brittany's face on the screen was calculating and cruel, nothing like the polished elegance she tried so hard to wear. The room went dead still. Brittany stood frozen, her face shifting from pale to flaming red with shame and rage. Patricia looked at her daughter with a complicated expression. Not disappointment at what she'd done, but disappointment that she'd been caught. Preston stepped back, as if he wanted to separate himself from the scandal. Howard stared at the footage, then at Brittany, then back at the footage again, as if he couldn't believe his own eyes. Audrey stood there with tears streaming down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from relief, and from a pain that cut deeper than humiliation. Pain from realizing her own family could be this vicious. Brittany opened her mouth, scrambling for an explanation. I just wanted to teach her a lesson. She humiliated our family by bringing some strange man in here and..." Patricia lifted a hand to stop her. But she didn't apologize to Audrey. Instead, she spoke in a voice cold as ice. "This ends here. No one mentions it again." Audrey looked at her aunt, her eyes full of accusation. "You're not going to say anything? You're not going to make her apologize?" Patricia met her stare, not a trace of remorse in her eyes. "Apologize for what? Either way, your presence always causes trouble. Maybe Brittany used the wrong method, but she wasn't wrong about the intention." The words struck Audrey like a slap. She stood there, unable to believe that after everything they'd just seen, her aunt was still protecting the person who'd framed her. Howard rose, his face weary, as if he only wanted it over. "Audrey, maybe you should leave. Let everyone cool off. We can talk later." Audrey looked at her uncle, the last person she'd thought might stand with her, and understood with sudden clarity that she'd never truly had a family here. She'd only been an outsider they tolerated, and now even that thin tolerance was gone. Before she could say anything, a weak voice came from the corner of the room. "Audrey, come here to Grandma." Ruth sat in her wheelchair, her eyes wet with tears, but her voice steady. Audrey ran to her and dropped to her knees, taking Ruth's frail hand in both of hers. Ruth stroked her hair and whispered, her voice soft but clear, "I'm sorry I made you endure them for so many years. I thought I could change them, but I was wrong." Audrey's tears fell onto Ruth's hand. "It's not your fault." Ruth shook her head. "Listen to me. Don't let them cage you anymore. You deserve freedom. You deserve to live. You deserve to be loved. Don't ever forget that." She lifted her gaze toward Maxim standing nearby. "He'll take you away. I trust him." Audrey wanted to stay with her, but Ruth brushed it aside. "Go. I'll be all right. I just need to know you're safe." Maxim stepped in and placed a gentle hand on Audrey's shoulder. "Come on. You don't belong here." He spoke to the whole room, but his eyes locked on Patricia. "She's leaving, but not because you're driving her out, because she deserves more than anything you're capable of giving." Patricia opened her mouth as if to spit something cruel, but the look in Maxim's eyes made her stop. There was something in that gaze, a raw kind of power she recognized by instinct as something she shouldn't challenge. Audrey stood, hugged Ruth one last time, and then followed Maxim toward the door. She didn't look back, because she knew if she did, she wouldn't have the courage to keep going. As they crossed through the great front doors, a figure emerged from the shadows. Gerald stood there, tense, his voice a hurried whisper. "Mr. Volkov, please wait a moment." Maxim stopped, his eyes sharpening. Gerald looked around to make sure no one could hear, then spoke quickly. "I know who you are. I served the Volkov family 20 years ago, when your father was still alive." Maxim said nothing, only waited. Gerald went on, his voice trembling slightly with urgency. "You need to be careful. Konstantin Petrov has someone in this family." Audrey's heart seemed to stop at the unfamiliar name. Maxim asked, his voice cold as steel. "Who?" Gerald swallowed. "Preston Whitmore. He launders money for Petrov through his investment firm. The Bennetts are a front, whether they know it or not." Maxim nodded once, his expression darkening. "Thank you. You've risked a lot by telling me." Gerald looked at Audrey with deep pity. "That girl deserves protection. Keep her safe." Then he turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Audrey with 100 questions spinning through her mind. Volkov, Petrov, Preston. She'd just stepped into a world she'd never known existed, and the man standing beside her, the man she'd hired for $100, was clearly at the center of it all. They walked out through the gates of the Bennett estate in silence. Audrey felt as if she'd just escaped a prison she'd locked herself inside for 19 years. The night air cut like a blade, but she wasn't trembling anymore. She'd gone numb. Maxim walked beside her, his steps steady on the thin layer of snow, and she realized he didn't look surprised by anything Gerald had just revealed, as if he'd known already, as if he'd come here for exactly that. Before Audrey could ask a single question, a glossy black Mercedes glided up and stopped right in front of them. The door opened, and a middle-aged man with a cold, unreadable face stepped out, bowed to Maxim, and greeted him in Russian. Maxim answered with a few short words, then turned to Audrey. "Get in. I'll take you somewhere safe." Audrey stood frozen, suspicion and fear tangling in her chest. She'd just walked out of a wolf's den, and now she didn't know what she was stepping into. But when she looked back at the brightly lit mansion behind her, where the people who had just tried to destroy her were raising champagne to the new year, She understood she didn't have another choice. She got into the car. The Mercedes moved smoothly along snow-covered roads toward Manhattan. Through the window, Audrey watched New York living inside the breathless moment of transition. People poured onto sidewalks with glasses in their hands, shouting the countdown at the sky. 10, 9, 8, 7. The numbers echoed from far away like a dream. Then fireworks burst open overhead, thousands of glittering colors reflecting off glass towers, off the dark sweep of the Hudson, off Audrey's wet eyes. She sat inside the car, watching the world celebrate outside, and felt like a stranger to everything. Maxim sat beside her, silent, eyes forward. When the last fireworks faded, Audrey turned to him, her voice tired but trying to be gentle. "Happy New Year, stranger." Maxim looked back at her, and for the first time that night, the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but close. "Happy New Year, Audrey Bennett." Audrey couldn't remember when she'd fallen asleep. When she opened her eyes, morning light was spilling through thin white curtains. She was lying in a massive bed, sheets soft as clouds, blankets warm like an embrace. It took her a few seconds to understand she wasn't in her miserable studio in Queens. She sat up, panicked, and looked around. The room was enormous, its design minimal, yet everything about it spoke of expensive luxury. Through a wall of glass, she saw all of Manhattan spread out beneath her, skyscrapers gleaming under early sunlight. A penthouse, the kind she'd only ever seen in movies or glossy magazines. Her heart kicked hard as she sprang out of bed and rushed toward the door. Maxim stood by the living room window with a cup of coffee in his hand, his back to her. He'd changed into different clothes, still simple, but there was something different about the way he held himself this morning, as if he were standing exactly where he belonged. When he heard Audrey's footsteps, he turned. "You're awake. There's coffee on the table." Audrey didn't care about coffee. She stood in the middle of the room, fists clenched, her voice shaking with panic. "Where is this? What time is it?" "I have a shift at 5 o'clock in the morning, and my grandmother is still in the hospital. I have to." She turned as if to search for her phone, but Maxim stepped closer, his voice calm and firm. "Audrey, stop." She stopped, staring at him with wide, anxious eyes. Maxim went on. "It's 10 o'clock in the morning. You slept almost 8 hours. I called the hospital. Your grandmother is stable. The nurses are taking care of her. And your job?" He hesitated for a moment. "You don't need to worry about that right now." Audrey shook her head. "You don't understand. I can't lose my job. I need money for the medical bills, for rent." Maxim set his coffee down and moved closer. "I do understand, but there are things we need to talk about first." Audrey looked at him and remembered what Gerald had said the night before. Volkov, Petrov, Preston. The names spun through her mind like a maze with no exit. She drew a slow breath, forcing herself toward steadiness. "Last night, the butler called you Volkov. He said you needed to be careful with someone named Petrov, and that Preston works for him." She held Maxim's gaze, her voice no longer shaking, hardening into something firm. "I followed you here because I had nowhere else to go. But I'm not stupid. I know you're not an ordinary man. I know something is happening that I don't understand." She took one step closer, her eyes burning with resolve. "So before I decide whether I stay here or walk out that door, you owe me the truth. Who are you? Why were you standing outside my family's gate last night? And what have I accidentally stepped into?" Maxim looked at her for a long, long moment. Then he nodded, as if he'd reached a decision. "All right. You deserve to know. But you need to sit down, because what I'm about to tell you will change the way you see everything." Audrey sat down on the sofa, her hands gripping the cushion as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling into an abyss. Maxim stood across from her, his back against the tall glass windows, the morning light behind him turning him into a dark silhouette, his expression impossible to read. He stayed quiet for a long time, as if he were searching for a way to begin a story he'd never told anyone. Then he spoke, his voice low and unhurried. "My full name is Maxim Dmitrievich Volkov. My father was Dmitry Volkov, the man you saw in that photograph on the Bennett wall last night. He was the second-generation head of the Volkov Empire, an organization that controls maritime shipping, container ports, and other things you don't want the details of, up and down the east coast of the United States. When he died 10 years ago, I inherited everything. I'm the third generation." Audrey swallowed hard, feeling as if the air in the room had thickened. She'd known, she'd sensed it since last night, yet hearing him say it still made her dizzy. Maxim continued, his voice not wavering. 5 years ago, I had a sister named Irina. She was 22, beautiful, stubborn, and the only person on earth who could make me smile without calculation. She loved a man named Konstantin Petrov. He paused, his jaw tightening as if the name tasted bitter. Konstantin was my adopted brother. My father took him from an orphanage in Russia when he was 10. We grew up together, trained together, and I once considered him my own blood. But Konstantin was always second, and he never forgot it. When Irina told me she loved Konstantin, I objected, not because he wasn't worthy, but because my instincts told me something about him wasn't right. I forbade Irina from seeing him. Maxim turned away to look out through the glass, his voice sinking as he slipped into memory. That night, I received intelligence about an attack being planned. I ordered Irina to stay inside, not to leave for any reason, but she didn't listen. She snuck out to meet Konstantin. Audrey saw Maxim's shoulders go rigid, his hand curling into a fist. He went on, his voice rougher. Irina's car was ambushed on the road. 3 bullets went through the windshield. She died on the spot. A heavy silence filled the room. Audrey didn't dare breathe too loudly. Maxim turned back to her, and for the first time she saw real pain in his eyes, the kind of pain that had been buried beneath ice for 5 years. I killed her, Audrey. Not with my own hands, but with my control. I forbade her to see the man she loved, and she went anyway because she couldn't stand being caged. If I hadn't forbidden it, maybe she would have been home safe that night. If I'd let her be free, maybe she'd still be alive. Audrey wanted to say something, but her throat closed. The man in front of her wasn't a powerful boss anymore. He was a man carrying guilt heavier than any burden she'd ever known. Maxim drew a breath, forcing steadiness back into his voice. After Irina died, I investigated. I found out Konstantin had leaked my sister's schedule to our enemies. Maybe he didn't know they would kill her. Maybe he only wanted chaos so he could take my place. But whatever the reason, he was guilty. When I was ready to move, Konstantin disappeared. For 5 years he's been hiding, building allies, laundering money through shell companies, waiting for the day he can overthrow me. He looked Audrey straight in the eye. Preston Whitmore is one of them. Whitmore Capital is a front for laundering Konstantin's money, and the Bennett family, whether they know it or not, is tied to that pipeline through Brittany and Preston's upcoming marriage. Audrey felt her head spin. Her family, the people who'd treated her like dirt for years, were tangled up in crime, and the man she'd hired for $100 was the head of an underground empire hunting an enemy. She stood, her legs a little unsteady but her voice firm. "So you're Mafia?" It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Maxim didn't look away. "If that's what you want to call it, then yes." Audrey shook her head. "There's no other word for what you just described. Shipping, ports, protection, laundering, murder. That's Mafia." Maxim took one step closer, his voice low but not defensive. "I won't deny what my family has done. But the world isn't as simple as you think, Audrey. There's no absolute white and black. I'm the one trying to keep order in a chaotic world. I protect the people who work for me. I don't kill innocent people. And I've spent 5 years hunting the man who indirectly killed my sister, not for revenge, but to make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else." Audrey stared at him, searching his eyes for a lie and finding none. "Only a man who'd already lost too much and was trying not to lose more," she asked, her voice smaller now. "Then why were you outside my gate last night? Why did you agree to pretend to be my boyfriend?" Maxim was quiet for a moment, then said, "I was there to watch Preston, to gather information. I had no intention of stepping inside." He paused, and his gaze softened slightly when it returned to her. "Then you appeared, shaking in an old dress, your eyes red, holding that $100 bill as if it was everything you had. You looked at me and asked me to pretend, not because you wanted to impress anyone, but because you only wanted someone to stand beside you." He drew in a breath. "Your eyes looked like Irina's on the last night I saw her, exhausted, alone, but still standing. I couldn't walk away." Audrey felt her heart tighten. She didn't know whether to be afraid, angry, or moved. All of it tangled together into something she couldn't name. She only knew her life had shifted completely, and she was standing in the middle of a storm she'd never prepared for. Audrey stood in the middle of the luxurious penthouse, looking around as if she were truly seeing it for the first time. The expensive paintings on the walls, the leather sofa that probably cost as much as a full year of her rent, the glass windows that held all of Manhattan in their frame as if the city itself were laid out at the owner's feet. This was Maxim Volkov's world, a world of power, of secrets, of blood and money. And she, a waitress in frayed threads and borrowed hope, felt like an ink blot on the white silk canvas of his world. She turned to Maxim, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Thank you for telling me the truth. And thank you for last night, for protecting me in front of them." She paused, drew in a slow breath. "But I can't stay here. I don't belong in your world." Maxim didn't look surprised, as if he'd expected this. He only asked, "Where will you go? Back to that apartment in Queens? Or back to the Bennetts so they can keep treating you like trash?" Audrey flinched because the question hit straight into her pain, but she didn't back down. "That's my problem, not yours. I've survived for 27 years without anyone. I'll keep doing it." She held his gaze, forcing determination into her voice. "You have your war with Constantine or whoever. I don't want to be involved. I just want to live my ordinary life, even if it's awful." Maxim stepped closer, not to threaten her, but as if he needed her to understand something that mattered. "You think if you walk out that door, you'll be safe? Preston saw you with me. Constantine may already know about you. You're not invisible anymore." Audrey shook her head. "I'm a nobody waitress. I don't have any value to people like them." Maxim looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. "You have value to me, and in this world, that alone is enough to make you a target." The words made Audrey falter for a beat, but she forced down the strange feeling spreading through her chest. She couldn't afford weakness. She couldn't let a man, no matter how powerful or how dangerously compelling, pull her into a world she didn't understand and couldn't control. She'd depended on the Bennett family once, and look where that had taken her. She wouldn't make the same mistake again. "I appreciate your concern," Audrey said, her voice hardening, "but I don't need anyone to protect me. I've taken care of myself and my grandmother for years. I'll keep doing that." Maxim tilted his head, and something like sadness crossed his eyes. "You keep saying you've survived for 27 years, but surviving isn't living." Audrey felt as if he'd slapped her. Those were her words, the ones she'd said to him on the balcony the night before, and now he was turning them back on her. She clenched her teeth. "Don't quote my own words at me." Maxim didn't argue. He only stood there, watching her with eyes she couldn't read. Audrey turned away and searched for her purse. She dug inside, pulled out the crumpled $100 bill, the one she'd pressed into his hand last night. She walked back to Maxim and placed it in his palm. "Here. You did the job. You pretended to be my boyfriend for one night. Now we're even." Maxim looked down at the bill, then up at her. "You think $100 pays for what happened last night?" Audrey gave a sad smile. "No, but it's all I have. Consider it a tip." She turned and walked toward the elevator, every step heavy as if she were dragging lead. She didn't know whether she was doing the right thing or the wrong thing. She only knew she had to leave, had to get out of this penthouse, out of Maxim Volkov's gaze, out of the strange feeling that kept trying to convince her to stay. When the elevator doors opened, Audrey stepped inside and looked back at Maxim one last time. He stood there, one hand holding that crumpled $100 bill, his eyes on her with something she didn't dare to name. She wanted to say something, but no words came. The doors slid shut, and the last thing she saw was Maxim Volkov standing alone in a sunlit penthouse, gripping that bill as if it were the most precious thing he'd ever held. The elevator descended, and Audrey leaned back against the wall, eyes closing. She'd done the right thing. She had to believe that. But why did her chest hurt so badly, as if she'd just left something important behind before she even understood what it was? 3 days passed like a long, relentless nightmare. Audrey went back to her miserable Queens apartment, back to waiting tables on the night shift and cleaning offices in the morning, back to the life she'd been living for years. But something had changed. She wasn't the Audrey Bennett of last week anymore. Every night, when she lay on her worn-out bed listening to the steady drip from the leaking kitchen faucet, Maxim's words kept echoing inside her head. "Preston works for Constantine. The Bennett family is a laundering front. Ruth is living among criminals without even knowing it." The thought wouldn't let Audrey sleep. She tried to push it away, told herself it wasn't her business. that she'd chosen to walk away from Maxim Volkov's world. But the image of Ruth sitting in her wheelchair in that mansion, surrounded by people who might be criminals, haunted Audrey without mercy. By the third day, Audrey made a decision. She couldn't sit still and wait. She needed the truth. Not for Maxim, not for anyone else, but for Ruth and for herself. If her family was truly tangled up in crime, she needed proof. She needed to know what she was facing. That afternoon, after finishing her office cleaning shift, Audrey took the subway out to Long Island. She knew the Bennett family's routines like the lines of her own palm. Every Wednesday, Patricia spent the whole day at the spa. Howard went to the golf club, and Brittany usually stayed at the company until evening. After the New Year's Eve scandal, Brittany probably wanted to avoid people even more. This was Audrey's only chance. She reached the Bennett mansion at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The main gate was shut, but Audrey knew a small way in around back, through the garden, where she used to play as a child before she'd been banned from the main house. The back door code hadn't changed in 10 years, 4 digits made from Ruth's birthday, and Audrey silently thanked Howard for his laziness. She slipped into the empty mansion, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. Every step on the wooden floor sounded like a drumbeat, but no one came. The staff had likely been given the day off, and Gerald, Audrey didn't know where he was, but she prayed he wouldn't appear. She went straight to Howard's office, the one room she'd never been allowed to enter. The door wasn't locked. Audrey sat down at her uncle's desk and began to search. She opened drawer after drawer, flipped through file after file, hunting for anything tied to Preston or Whitmore Capital. Most of it was real estate paperwork, lease agreements, family financial reports. Then she found a folder labeled WC Investment, and her heart seemed to stop. Inside were wire transfer contracts with staggering sums, memos signed by Howard, and most of all, printed emails between Preston and someone whose name was abbreviated as K. Petrov. Audrey photographed every page with her phone, her hands shaking so badly she had to take several shots of the same document. What she read made her feel sick. Money moved through multiple accounts in tax havens, then returned disguised as real estate investments. The Bennett family wasn't an accidental victim. Howard knew. He knew, and he stayed silent. She was still reading when she heard footsteps behind her. Audrey whipped around, her heart leaping into her throat, and found herself face to face with Gerald. The old butler stood in the doorway, his lined face giving away nothing. Audrey stood up, her mouth opening to explain, but Gerald lifted a hand to stop her. "I knew you'd come back." Audrey swallowed hard. "Mister, Gerald, Gerald stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "You don't need to explain. I've been waiting for this day for 5 years." Audrey stared at him, not understanding. Gerald went on, his voice low and tired. "I've served the Bennett family for 40 years, and the Volkov family for 20 years before that. I've seen enough to know when something is wrong." He walked to the bookcase, opened a hidden compartment Audrey never knew existed, and pulled out a small USB drive. Gerald pressed the USB into Audrey's hand, his eyes so serious it was almost frightening. "Everything I've collected for the past 5 years is on here. Proof that Preston launders money for Petrov, Howard's secret calls, suspicious transactions. I kept it because I didn't know what to do." Neither of them realized that Preston, always suspicious of the family's old secrets, had installed a hidden microscopic camera in Howard's office, streaming the entire exchange directly to Konstantin Petrov's encrypted network. Audrey held the USB, her fingers trembling. "Why didn't you give it to the police?" Gerald let out a sad laugh, with no joy in it at all. "The police? You think Petrov doesn't have people inside the police? I've seen someone try to report them. That person disappeared without a trace." He looked Audrey straight in the eye. "You need someone stronger than the police. You need someone with enough power to face Petrov on his own playing field." Audrey knew exactly who he meant, Maxim Volkov, the man she'd just walked out of her life. Gerald seemed to read her thoughts. "I know you don't want to be tangled up in Mr. Volkov's world, but you already are, from the moment you were born a Bennett. The question now is what you're going to do with this truth." Audrey stared down at the USB in her hand, feeling as if she were holding a bomb with a ticking fuse. She didn't know what she should do. She only knew her life would never go back to normal again. Audrey left the Bennett mansion with the USB hidden deep in her coat pocket, her heart hammering so wildly it felt like it might burst through her ribs. She took the subway back to Queens, trying to look ordinary the way she always did. But the moment she stepped onto the train car, she felt something was wrong. A man in a black coat sat at the far end, his eyes never leaving her even as he pretended to read a newspaper. When Audrey got off, he got off. When she turned right, he turned right. Fear cinched tight around her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm, walking faster, blending into the crowd. When she glanced back one last time, before turning into the familiar alley that led to her apartment, the man was gone. Audrey let out a shaky breath, telling herself she was being paranoid. But that night, when she looked out her window, a glossy black car was parked at the corner, lights off, no one going in or out. It stayed there all night. The next day, things got worse. Audrey started noticing unfamiliar faces everywhere she went. A man smoking outside the restaurant where she worked, watching her through the glass. A woman lingering at the bus stop Audrey always used, even though 3 buses came and went, and she never got on. Audrey knew she wasn't imagining it anymore. She was being followed, and she knew who was behind it. On the second night after she took the USB, Audrey's phone rang. An unknown number, no name. She hesitated, then answered, and a man's low voice came through, gentle on the surface, threaded with a quiet threat. "Audrey Bennett, we finally get a chance to talk." Audrey went rigid, her hand clamped around the phone until her knuckles turned white. "Who are you?" The man gave a soft chuckle, with no warmth in it. "I think you already know. I'm Konstantin Petrov." The name made Audrey's blood feel like it turned to ice. This was the man Maxim had spent 5 years hunting. The man who'd indirectly killed Irina. The man laundering money through Preston's firm and using Audrey's family as cover. Audrey wanted to hang up immediately, but she needed to know what he wanted. "What do you want from me?" Konstantin replied, still calm, as if they were making small talk about the weather. "You have something that belongs to me. The USB Mr. Gerald gave you yesterday. I want it back." It felt like a fist had driven into Audrey's stomach. He knew. He knew everything. He'd had someone watching her for a long time. Konstantin continued, "Don't worry. I don't intend to make this difficult for you. You're just an ordinary girl who got unlucky and wandered into something that isn't your business. Give me the USB, and I'll give you peace. You can go back to waiting tables like nothing ever happened." He paused, then added in a syrupy tone that made Audrey's skin crawl. "I could even help your grandmother. Cancer treatment is expensive, isn't it? I could make sure Ruth gets care at the best hospitals." Audrey felt anger flare so hot it burned straight through her fear. He dared to use Ruth as leverage. He dared to think she'd sell herself for money. She clenched her teeth. "I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not giving you anything." Silence on the other end, just long enough to make the air feel heavier. Then Konstantin exhaled, his voice turning colder. "You're brave, like Irina. Maxim always gets drawn to women like that. But remember, Irina was brave too, and she died." Before Audrey could answer, she ended the call. Her hand shook, not from fear now, but from rage and hatred. She stared at the USB on the table, and a new resolve formed in her chest. She wouldn't let this man win. She wouldn't become anyone's puppet. But Konstantin wasn't the type to wait patiently. That night, after her shift ended at midnight, Audrey walked home through the familiar alley. She'd taken that route hundreds of times, but tonight everything felt different. The darkness seemed thicker, her footsteps sounded louder, and the air carried the smell of danger she'd never noticed before. She was halfway through when a shadow stepped out and blocked her path. A large man with his face covered, a knife in his hand. "The USB. Hand it over." Audrey backed up, her heart pounding out of control. She looked around for an escape, but behind her another man appeared, cutting off her retreat. Trapped. But Audrey didn't stand there and wait to die. She remembered the self-defense lessons she'd taken in college, before she'd had to drop out to care for Ruth. When the man in front lunged, she twisted aside and drove her foot hard into his knee. He staggered and howled in pain. Audrey didn't hesitate. She ran, as fast as she could, footsteps thundering behind her in the dark alley. She burst out onto the main street and screamed for help. But the street was empty at midnight. The footsteps kept coming. Closer. Closer. Audrey felt her lungs about to split, her legs turning heavy as lead. Then, suddenly, a black car surged toward her and screeched to a stop right in front of her. The door flew open, and a man jumped out, not to attack her, but to charge straight at the men chasing her. Audrey heard punches, heard groans, then heard running feet fading into the distance. She stood there, gasping, unable to understand what was happening. The man turned back, and Audrey recognized him. Yuri, the man she'd seen in the car on New Year's Eve. Yuri looked at her, his voice urgent. "Get in. Now." Audrey didn't argue. She climbed into the car, and the black Mercedes tore through the night. When her breathing finally steadied, she turned to Yuri. "Why are you here? How did you know I was in danger?" Yuri didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the road. "Mr. Volkov told me to keep an eye on you from the day you left the penthouse. He knew Konstantin wouldn't leave you alone." Audrey sat in the darkness, not knowing whether to be angry that she'd been watched or grateful that she'd been saved. She only knew one thing. She couldn't run from Maxim Volkov's world anymore. The black Mercedes stopped in front of a familiar building at 3 o'clock in the morning. Audrey recognized it immediately. It was the place she'd walked away from 3 days ago, Maxim Volkov's penthouse. She wanted to protest, wanted to demand that Yuri take her back to her apartment in Queens, but she knew it was pointless. Her apartment wasn't safe anymore. Nowhere was safe anymore, except here. She followed Yuri into the private elevator, and when the doors opened, Maxim was already there, waiting. He wore a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his hair slightly disheveled as if he'd dragged his hand through it again and again. His eyes swept over Audrey from head to toe, checking for injuries, and only then did his shoulders loosen, as if a weight had finally dropped. But Audrey didn't feel grateful. The anger that had built through the whole drive flared up, sudden and uncontrollable. She walked straight up to Maxim, her eyes burning. "You were watching me." It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Maxim didn't step back from her fury. He answered in a calm voice that still carried steel. "Yes, I was watching you." Audrey ground her teeth. "I told you I didn't need protection. I told you I wanted to live my life. You don't have the right." Maxim cut her off, his voice turning sharply cold. "And you almost died." The words stopped Audrey dead. Maxim moved closer, his face tight with tension. "If Yuri hadn't been there tonight, what do you think would have happened? You think they only wanted the USB and then they'd let you go? Konstantin doesn't leave witnesses, Audrey. You would have died in that dark alley, and no one would have found you until the next morning." Audrey wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could take care of herself, but the image of the knife flashing in the darkness, the pounding footsteps behind her, the feeling of her lungs about to burst as she ran, it was all still too vivid in her mind. She knew Maxim was right. Without Yuri, she probably wouldn't be standing here now. The anger inside her cooled, giving way to exhaustion and confusion. She let out a breath, her voice smaller. "Why do you care about me? I'm just a waitress you happened to meet for one night. I don't have any value in your war with Konstantin." Maxim looked at her, and for the first time since she'd walked in, she saw a crack in the armor. His shoulders trembled slightly, his hand clenched and unclenched as if he were fighting to hold something back. When he spoke, his voice wasn't cold anymore. It was rough with a feeling Audrey couldn't name. "I'm afraid of losing one more person." The words hung in the air, heavy and aching. Audrey looked into Maxim's eyes and understood he was talking about Irina, about the pain he'd carried for 5 years, about the guilt that gnawed at him every day. She didn't know what to say. She only knew she couldn't walk out that door anymore, not because she feared Konstantin, but because she didn't want to leave Maxim alone with the ghosts of his past. She gave a small nod. "I'll stay, at least for tonight." Maxim didn't speak, only nodded once in return. He showed her the room where she'd slept on New Year's Eve, then went back to his own room. Audrey lay down, drained by everything that had happened, but she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Maxim, about the pain in his eyes when he said he was afraid of losing one more person, about the way he'd stood alone in the penthouse swallowed by darkness. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, Audrey heard a shout. She jolted upright, her heart racing, and ran out of her room. The sound came from Maxim's bedroom. She rushed to the door, shoved it open, and saw Maxim thrashing on the bed, drenched in sweat, muttering words in Russian she couldn't understand. He was having a nightmare. Audrey ran to the bedside, grabbed his shoulders, and shook him hard. "Maxim, Maxim, wake up." But he didn't wake. His eyes stayed shut, his face twisted with pain, and she heard a name spill from his lips. "Irina." Audrey tightened her grip, her voice clear and firm. "Maxim, you're dreaming. Wake up. Wake up." Suddenly, Maxim's eyes flew open. He surged upright, his hand snapping to Audrey's throat on instinct, his eyes wild like a cornered animal. Audrey didn't scream. She didn't fight. She only looked straight into his eyes. her voice steady. "You're safe. You're home. It's me, Audrey." Seconds stretched into something endless, then Maxim's gaze slowly returned to him. His hand fell from her throat, trembling. He stared at his own fingers as if he couldn't believe what he'd almost done, then looked at Audrey in horror. I'm sorry. I didn't." Audrey shook her head and sat down beside the bed, taking his shaking hand in hers. "It's all right. You were just having a nightmare." Maxim closed his eyes, his head bowing, his shoulders shuddering in waves. When he spoke, it was only a broken whisper. "I dream about her. Every night. Irina stands there and asks why I didn't come, why I didn't save her, why I let her die." Audrey squeezed his hand tighter, her voice gentle but unwavering. "You didn't kill her, Maxim. You tried to protect her the only way you knew. You can't control everything. You couldn't predict she would sneak out." She looked straight into his eyes. "Constantine is the guilty one. He leaked her schedule. He made her die, not you." Maxim looked at her, and for the first time Audrey saw the powerful head of the Volkov Empire as something other than an unbreakable fortress. He cracked right in front of her, a man carrying pain too large to hold alone. No tears, no sobbing, only a heavy silence and shoulders trembling in the dark. Audrey didn't know what she was doing. She only knew she couldn't leave him by himself. She stayed there, holding his hand, until the first hint of dawn began to bleed into the window. In the days after that nightmare, Audrey stayed at Maxim's penthouse, but she spent most of her time at the hospital, beside Ruth. Ruth's condition worsened day by day. The doctor said the cancer had metastasized, and there was nothing left to do except manage the pain and wait. Wait for what no one wanted to say out loud. Audrey sat by Ruth's bed every day, reading to her, telling her stories, holding her hand while she slept. She tried not to cry, because she knew Ruth hated seeing her sad. But every night when she returned to the penthouse, she cried alone in the bathroom, trying not to let anyone hear. Maxim knew, but he didn't say anything. He only left a cup of hot tea on the table each time she passed through the living room, a small gesture that made Audrey feel a little less alone. One afternoon, when Audrey came to visit, Ruth was awake and waiting for her. Ruth's eyes looked brighter than usual, as if she were gathering every last ounce of strength for this conversation. She motioned for Audrey to sit by the bed, then took her granddaughter's hand in her thin, bony fingers. She spoke, her voice weak, but each word clear. "Audrey, listen to me." Audrey nodded, trying to swallow the knot in her throat. Ruth looked at her with eyes full of love. "I don't have much time left, and I need you to promise me one thing." Audrey shook her head, tears spilling even as she tried to hold them back. "Don't say that, Grandma. You'll be fine." But Ruth tightened her grip and cut her off. "Listen to me. Promise me you'll live. Not just exist. Live." The words rang through Audrey's mind like a bell. It was what Maxim had told her on the balcony on New Year's Eve. It was what she'd thrown back at him when she walked away. And now her grandmother was saying the same thing, as if everything were leading her to the one truth she'd been trying to deny. Audrey nodded, her voice breaking. "I promise, Grandma." Ruth smiled, gentle and peaceful. Then she went on, her voice softer. "And one more thing. Don't hate them, Audrey. Patricia, Howard, Brittany. They're more pitiful than hateful. They don't know how to love because no one ever taught them." Audrey wanted to argue, wanted to say they didn't deserve forgiveness after everything they'd done, but Ruth seemed to read her thoughts. "Forgiveness isn't for them, my dear. Forgiveness is so you can be free. Don't let hatred cage you the way it caged them." Audrey couldn't speak. She only bowed her head onto Ruth's hand and cried, crying out of love, out of pain, because she knew this might be the last time she would hear Ruth's voice. 5 days later, at 3 o'clock in the morning, Audrey's phone rang. Before she even answered, she knew it was the call she'd been dreading for months. The nurse's voice on the other end was calm, full of compassion. "Miss Bennett, please come to the hospital right away. Ruth doesn't have much time." Audrey couldn't remember how she got dressed, couldn't remember how she ran out the door. She only knew that when she reached the hospital, Maxim was already there, waiting in the hallway. He didn't speak, only nodded and stepped aside to let her pass. Audrey rushed into Ruth's room, and her heart shattered at the sight of Ruth lying there, small and fragile among the machines and IV lines. Audrey sat beside the bed, took Ruth's hand, and Ruth opened her eyes. Ruth's gaze was dimmer now, but when she saw Audrey, a faint spark flickered. She tried to smile, her lips moving as if she wanted to say something. Audrey bent closer, and Ruth whispered, so softly, Audrey had to hold her breath to hear. "Maxim, he's good." I looked into his eyes and I knew. Audrey tried to speak, but Ruth continued, her breathing growing thinner. "Don't be afraid to love, my dear. Don't be afraid to be loved. You deserve—" The sentence never finished. Ruth's hand tightened around Audrey's one last time, then went slack. Ruth's eyes closed, and the monitor let out that long, flat sound Audrey would never forget for the rest of her life. Audrey didn't know how long she stayed there, holding Ruth's hand, refusing to accept she was gone. Nurses came, doctors came, someone gently pulled her out of the room. Audrey sank to the floor in the hallway, her back against the wall, and for the first time since she was 8 years old and lost her parents, she sobbed without restraint. She cried because Ruth was gone. She cried because the only person who had ever truly loved her was no longer here. She cried because from this moment on, she was completely alone. Then she felt someone sit down beside her. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Maxim sat there in silence, not saying a word. He didn't hold her. He didn't try to comfort her. He didn't offer empty promises that everything would be okay. He only sat there, shoulder to shoulder with her, letting her know she wasn't alone. And in that moment, in the middle of tearing grief, Audrey understood that sometimes a silent presence is worth more than 1,000 words. Dawn light began to slip through the hallway windows, and Audrey sat there beside the man her grandmother had trusted, crying until she had no tears left to cry. Ruth's funeral took place on a bitter cold morning, with only a handful of people in attendance. Audrey stood by the grave and watched the casket lower slowly into the earth, and she didn't cry. She'd used up all her tears over the last 3 days. Patricia and Howard were there, standing off to one side, their faces solemn, but Audrey knew they'd come for appearances. Brittany didn't bother to show up. Maxim stood behind Audrey, silent as a shadow, not interfering, but always there. When the service ended, Audrey didn't speak to anyone. She simply turned and walked away, leaving Patricia with her mouth half open as if she were about to say something, and leaving Howard staring at her with a complicated look she didn't care to decode. 3 days after the funeral, Audrey sat alone in a room at the penthouse, staring at the USB Gerald had given her. The tiny drive rested in her palm, but it held a force that could change everything. She thought of Ruth, of Ruth's last words. Live, not just exist. For 27 years, Audrey had existed. She existed through her parents' death, existed through the Bennett family's contempt, existed through exhausting night shifts and half-eaten meals because there wasn't enough money, but she'd never truly lived. She'd never stood up for herself, never fought for what she believed was right. Ruth had taught her that forgiveness is how you become free. But forgiveness doesn't mean staying silent in the face of evil. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting men like Konstantin Petrov keep hurting people. Audrey took out her phone and searched for a name Gerald had mentioned. Michelle Torres, an investigative journalist who specialized in organized crime, who had chased Petrov for years without enough proof. Audrey dialed and waited. When a woman's voice answered, Audrey spoke, calm and steady. "Miss Torres? My name is Audrey Bennett. I have evidence on Konstantin Petrov and his money laundering operation. I want to meet you." There was a pause, then Michelle Torres replied, her tone interested but careful. "Miss Bennett, do you understand how dangerous that is? Petrov isn't someone you deal with easily." Audrey looked out the window at New York stretched out beneath the building. "I understand, but I have nothing left to lose, and I have a promise to keep." After she hung up, Audrey went to find Maxim. He was in his office, seated at a desk, covered with dozens of documents and computer screens glowing with lines. No. When she stepped in, he looked up, his sharp eyes reading immediately that something had shifted inside her. Audrey stood in front of him, her back straight, her gaze steady. "I'm going to testify. I'm going to give the evidence to Michelle Torres, and I'm going to court if it comes to that." Maxim didn't look surprised. He studied her for a long moment, then asked, "You know Konstantin won't let you do this in peace." Audrey nodded. "I know." Maxim stood and moved closer. "You'll need protection." Audrey shook her head. "No, I need allies, not a protector. I need someone to fight beside me, not fight for me." Maxim looked at her, and she caught something in his eyes. Maybe respect, maybe admiration, maybe something deeper she didn't dare name. "All right, Then we'll fight together. That afternoon, Audrey returned to the Bennett mansion. This time she didn't sneak. She walked straight through the front gate, rang the bell, and waited. When the door opened and Patricia stood there with a look of surprise mixed with irritation, Audrey didn't wait for her to speak. She stepped inside and went straight to the living room where Howard sat reading the paper. Both of them stared at her as if she were a ghost. Audrey stood in the room that had been the stage of her humiliation, her framing, her contempt for years, and she spoke, her voice carrying through the silence. I know about Preston. I know about Whitmore Capital and the laundering pipeline for Petrov. I know you signed those papers. Howard went pale, the newspaper slipping from his hands. Patricia stiffened, a flash of fear crossing her eyes before she smothered it. You don't know what you're talking about. Audrey smiled, a smile without bitterness or hatred, only the calm of someone who had moved beyond fear. I know exactly what I'm talking about. And I'm not here to threaten you or get revenge. I'm here to tell you the truth is coming out. Not because I want to hurt anyone, but because I can't let people like Petrov keep hurting others. She looked Patricia straight in the eye. I'm not afraid anymore. She taught me that. Not you, not him, Ruth. Then Audrey turned and walked out of the mansion without looking back, without regret. For the first time in her life, Audrey Bennett felt like she was truly living. 2 weeks after the confrontation at the Bennett mansion, Michelle Torres's investigative piece hit the front page. The bold headlines stretched across newspapers and flooded social media. A multi-million-dollar money laundering pipeline. When Long Island's upper crust becomes a front for organized crime. The article laid out every transaction, every figure, every name, alongside photographs of the documents Audrey had provided. Preston Whitmore III was arrested in the Whitmore Capital office the very morning the story ran. Images of him in handcuffs, marched out of the building with a face gone pale and eyes gone wild, looped across every news channel. Brittany appeared in front of cameras with swollen eyes, screaming that it was a conspiracy, that Preston was innocent, that someone was trying to destroy her family. But nobody listened. The evidence was too clear, too detailed to deny. Howard was summoned for questioning about his role in signing the transfer paperwork. He wasn't arrested, but his name and reputation were stained beyond repair. Patricia stayed silent, her reputation ruined and her assets frozen by the federal investigation, forced to hide behind the mansion doors as her world crumbled. Audrey watched it all from Maxim's penthouse, and her feelings were more complicated than she'd expected. She wasn't happy to see the Bennett family collapse. She didn't feel triumphant watching Brittany cry on television. She only felt a strange hollowness, as if a chapter of her life had closed and she had no idea what the next one would demand of her. But there was one man who didn't stay quiet about what was happening. Konstantin Petrov had lost his most important ally in the United States. Preston had been his primary laundromat, and now the FBI was digging into the entire financial web. He was furious, and when Konstantin Petrov was furious, he was dangerous. Audrey's phone rang one afternoon, 3 days after the article was published. The number was unfamiliar, but she knew who it was before she answered. Konstantin's voice came through, still calm like before, but with a tightness she could hear if she listened closely. Miss Bennett, looks like you've been busy. Audrey didn't reply, letting silence do what words couldn't. Konstantin continued, I want to see you. One final conversation, before things go too far. Audrey knew she should refuse. She knew Maxim would fight her on it if he found out, but she also knew that if she wanted this to end, she had to face Konstantin. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she couldn't let fear run her life anymore. She said, Fine. The corner cafe at 53rd and Madison, 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Public place. Konstantin gave a soft laugh. Smart. All right, we'll play by your rules. The next day, Audrey arrived 15 minutes early. She chose a table near the window, where foot traffic stayed thick, where she could see the room and the street beyond. She knew Yuri was somewhere outside on Maxim's orders, even though she'd told Maxim she needed to do this alone. Maxim wasn't happy, but he understood. He understood this was Audrey's fight, and she needed to meet it on her own feet. At exactly 2 o'clock, Konstantin walked in. He was tall, handsome in a cold, merciless way, wearing a flawless gray suit, hair slicked neatly back. If you didn't know who he was, you could have mistaken him for an ordinary, successful businessman. But Audrey knew. She knew that behind the polished charm lived the man who'd indirectly killed Irina, who'd laundered money for criminals, who'd threatened Audrey and Ruth without blinking. Constantine sat across from her, ordered a black coffee, then studied Audrey with a measuring gaze. You've changed since New Year's Eve. Back then you were just a trembling girl in an old dress. Now you're sitting here facing me like you're not afraid of anything. Audrey didn't take the bait. She only asked, "What do you want?" Constantine leaned in, lowering his voice. "I want to make you one last offer. Step back. Tell the police you were forced to hand over those documents. Say Maxim Volkov used you. I'll handle the rest." Audrey stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. "And what do I get?" Constantine smiled. "You get to live. You get to be free. You can even have money. A lot of money. Enough to start over anywhere you want." Audrey went quiet for a moment, as if she were considering it, letting him think hope had found a crack. Then she asked, her voice gentle but sharp as a blade, "Who leaked Irina's schedule that night?" Constantine stiffened, the smile sliding off his mouth. Audrey kept going. "You think Maxim doesn't know? You think you can hide forever that you told his enemies where she'd be?" The air between them thickened until it felt hard to breathe. Constantine's eyes darkened, his jaw grinding. "You don't know anything about that." Audrey didn't move back an inch. "I know enough, and I know that no matter how much you threaten me or try to buy me, I won't step back." Constantine studied her for a long time, then shook his head. "You picked the wrong side, Miss Bennett. Maxim isn't a knight. He's a monster too, just a monster in a more expensive suit." Audrey stood, looking down at him without a trace of fear. "I didn't pick a side. I picked myself. I picked what's right, even if that means standing against you or anyone else." She turned and walked away without looking back. She heard Constantine's voice follow her, cold as ice. "You'll regret this, Audrey Bennett." She didn't answer. She just stepped out into the sunlight, heart racing, spine straight. She'd made her choice, and she wasn't turning around. 1 week after the meeting at the cafe, Maxim received intelligence on Constantine's hiding place, an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district of South Brooklyn, where he was preparing to leave the United States before the FBI could catch him. Maxim didn't tell Audrey. He knew she'd stop him. She'd say to let the law handle it. She'd remind him of what he'd promised. But this wasn't a matter for the law. This was between him and Constantine, between two men who had once been brothers, between 5 years of pain and the truth Maxim needed to hear from the traitor's own mouth. He went to the warehouse alone, stepping into the darkness with a gun tucked behind his back but with no intention of using it. Unbeknownst to Maxim, Yuri had been monitoring his movements. Fearing that his boss was about to cross a line he could never return from, Yuri reached out to Audrey and provided the exact coordinates of the warehouse, knowing she was the only one who could save Maxim's soul. He wanted to use his own hands. Constantine stood in the middle of the warehouse as if he'd been waiting. Around him were suitcases already packed, ready for a trip with no return. When he saw Maxim walk in, he didn't look surprised. He only smiled, the tired smile of a man who'd known the ending for a long time. "So you finally came. I've been waiting for this day for 5 years." Maxim stopped a few steps away, his eyes black as hell. "Why?" One word, carrying 5 years of pain and hatred. Constantine looked at him, and for the first time the cold mask on his face cracked. "You want to know why? Because I loved her. I've loved Irina since we were kids, but you wouldn't allow it. You forbade her from seeing me like I was some stray dog that didn't deserve to touch your sister." Maxim clenched his teeth. "I forbade it because I didn't trust you. And I was right." Constantine let out a bitter laugh. "You were right. You caged her. You controlled everything in her life. And you think you were right." He stepped closer, his voice shaking with anger. "I didn't mean to kill her. I only wanted chaos so you'd be distracted, so I could take her far away from you. I didn't know they would." He stopped, swallowing hard. "I didn't know they would kill her." Maxim heard those words, and something inside him shattered. For 5 years he'd imagined 1,000 reasons for Constantine's betrayal. Money, power, ambition. He'd never imagined love. He'd never imagined that the brother he'd once trusted could love his sister enough to ruin everything. And that truth made him angrier than any other reason ever could. Before Constantine could react, Maxim lunged. The first punch slammed into Constantine's face and sent him stumbling. The second punch dropped him to the floor. Maxim didn't stop. He hit and kicked, pouring into Constantine every ounce of grief, every loss, every nightmare, every day of self-punishment. Blood splattered across his hands and his shirt, and he didn't care. All he could see was Irina's face on that last night, her eyes full of tears as she begged him to let her be free, and he'd refused. He'd caged her, and Constantine had killed her. Both of them were guilty. Both of them deserved to die. Maxim grabbed Constantine by the collar and yanked him up, his other hand clenched, ready for the final blow. Constantine's eyes were swollen, blood spilling from his nose and mouth, but he still laughed, a choking sound. "Kill me. End it. I've been waiting for this for a long time." Maxim raised his hand, and at that exact moment a voice rang out from the warehouse doorway. "Maxim!" He turned and saw Audrey standing there, face pale, eyes full of tears, but her voice steady. "Look at me." Maxim froze, his hand still raised, Constantine still beneath him. Audrey walked forward, each step slow but unafraid. "If you kill him, you become what you hate. You become him." She stopped in front of Maxim and reached up to take his raised fist in her hand. "Irina wouldn't want this. She loved you, and she wouldn't want you to become a murderer because of her." Maxim looked into Audrey's eyes, and he didn't see fear. He didn't see judgment. He only saw understanding and love. Fanned, lowered, inch by inch. He let Constantine go and stepped back, his whole body shaking. Audrey wrapped her arms around him, and Maxim bowed his head against her shoulder, not crying, but trembling like a leaf. 3 months later, Konstantin Petrov's trial took place in a federal court in New York. The courtroom was packed with reporters, attorneys, and curious onlookers hungry to witness the collapse of a criminal empire. Audrey sat in the witness seats with her back straight and her eyes forward. When it was her turn to testify, Konstantin's defense attorney tried to undermine her. "Miss Bennett, you're romantically involved with Maxim Volkov. Aren't you, the man who leads a rival criminal organization to my clients?" Audrey looked the attorney in the eye, then looked toward the jury, her voice clear in the courtroom. "I love him. That's true." A murmur ran through the room. Audrey continued, not wavering, "But that doesn't change the facts. I saw the documents proving Preston Whitmore laundered money for Konstantin Petrov. I heard Konstantin Petrov threaten me and my grandmother with my own ears. I love Maxim Volkov, but I'm here for justice, not for him." The courtroom fell silent. The jurors looked at her with respect. Even the defense attorney couldn't find a way to push back. After 2 weeks of trial, the jury delivered its verdict. Konstantin Petrov was guilty on 17 counts, including money laundering, extortion, witness intimidation, and complicity in the killing of Irina Volkov. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, Audrey looked at Konstantin. He sat there without expression, as if he'd accepted his fate long ago. Then he turned to look at her, and Audrey saw that the hatred and the threats were gone from his eyes. There was only the emptiness of a man who'd lost everything. She looked away and took Maxim's hand as he sat beside her. He squeezed her hand tight, not saying a word, but she could feel the relief spreading through him. 5 years. Finally, it was over. They walked out of the courthouse into the spring sunlight, and for the first time since they'd met, they both felt like they could breathe. 1 year after the trial, on a quiet little street in Brooklyn, there was a bakery called Ruth's Kitchen. It wasn't big, just a few rustic wooden tables, cushioned chairs upholstered in soft floral fabric, and the warm, irresistible scent of fresh bread drifting out from early morning. On the wall hung a black and white photograph of an elderly woman with a gentle smile, and beneath it, in handwritten letters, the words, "Live, not just exist." Audrey Bennett stood behind the counter, her white apron dusted with flour, her hands moving quickly as she kneaded dough for the afternoon batch of croissants. She'd opened this shop with money she'd earned herself. Money from the settlement after legal battles revealed that Howard had withheld her parents' rightful inheritance for nearly 2 decades, savings from the days she'd worked herself raw, and a small bank loan she paid down month by month. Maxim had offered to help, but Audrey refused. She needed to do this on her own. She needed to prove to herself that she could stand on her own 2 feet, dependent on no one, owing no one. Maxim still came to see her every week. He didn't live with her, and she didn't move into his penthouse. They had a strange relationship that no one understood except the 2 of them. He would come, sit at the corner table by the window, drink black coffee with no sugar, and watch her work. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they simply sat in silence together, and that silence felt easier than any conversation. Audrey didn't ask about Maxim's work, about the Volkov Empire, or the things he did in the dark, and Maxim didn't force her to become part of that world. They respected each other's boundaries, yet still found a way to meet in the middle. On New Year's Eve that year, Audrey decided to keep the shop open later than usual. She wanted to watch the fireworks through the bakery window, wanted to welcome the new year in a place Ruth would have been proud of if she were still alive. She was wiping down the pastry counter when the bell above the door rang. Audrey looked up and saw Maxim standing in the doorway, snow whitening his coat shoulders, his eyes bright as they landed on her. He stepped inside, pulled a bill from his pocket, and placed it on the counter. $100, wrinkled and worn, the same bill Audrey had pressed into his hand on New Year's Eve the year before, and later returned when she walked out of his penthouse. Audrey stared at the bill, then looked up at Maxim, confused. He smiled, that rare smile she'd come to love. $100 and one night. That was our original deal, wasn't it? Audrey laughed, the sound clear and bright in the empty bakery. She shook her head and slid the bill back toward him. This time I'm paying in coffee. She went into the back, made 2 cups, then brought them out and set them on the small table by the window. They sat there, watching the streets of Brooklyn fill with people spilling out to welcome the new year. The countdown drifted in from somewhere far off. 10, 9, 8, 7. Audrey turned to Maxim, and she saw him looking at her with a gaze she'd learned to read over the past year. Not possession, not overprotection, only the simple love of a man who'd learned to love without control. I'm not promising forever, Audrey murmured, still holding his eyes. I don't even know what forever is. I only know today. I only need one day at a time. Maxim nodded, his hand reaching across the table to take hers. One day is enough. One day is all I need. Outside the window, fireworks began to burst across the Brooklyn sky. Thousands of brilliant sparks reflected in Audrey's eyes, and she smiled, the first smile in a long time that held pure joy with no pain mixed in. Happy New Year, Maxim Volkov, she said. Happy New Year, Audrey Bennett, he answered. They sat there in the small bakery named for Ruth, hand in hand, watching fireworks bloom overhead. Audrey thought of the year behind her, from the trembling girl in an old dress to the woman who owned her own bakery. She'd lost Ruth, but she'd found herself. She'd faced a toxic family, dangerous criminals, the fear that had caged her for 27 years. And she'd won. Not because someone saved her, but because she saved herself. Maxim wasn't a knight rescuing a princess. He was the man who stood beside her while she stood up. The man who held her hand while she learned to walk forward on her own. The man who believed in her while she learned to believe in herself. And maybe that was real love. Not being rescued, but having someone stand beside you while you rescue yourself. Audrey and Maxim's story didn't end with a lavish wedding or a perfect fairy tale ending. It ended with a small bakery, a cup of coffee, and a promise made one day at a time. Because life doesn't need forever. Life only needs people willing to walk with you step by step, day by day, for as long as they can. And for Audrey Bennett, the orphan girl who once believed she didn't deserve to be loved, that was more than enough. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. Audrey's story reminds us that no matter how harsh life gets, no matter how much you're looked down on or treated unfairly, you still have the right to stand up and rewrite your own story. Real love doesn't come from someone saving you. It comes from someone believing in you while you learn to believe in yourself. If this story touched your heart, if you saw a part of yourself in Audrey or in the people you love, please subscribe to the channel, tap like, and share this video so more people can hear meaningful stories like this one. We'd love to hear what you think. What's your take on Audrey's journey? Have you ever been through moments like that in your own life? Share with us in the comments below, because every one of your stories deserves to be heard. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.